The field was alive with fire and steel. Smoke curled upward from shattered earth as explosions tore through the morning mist. A Panzer IV tilted violently, one track shredded, the turret jammed. The crew inside scrambled, shouting orders over the roar of their dying machine. Across the ridge, another Sherman rolled forward, its engine growling, the .75 caliber gun spitting fire with deadly precision. Lieutenant Weber wiped sweat from his brow, squinting through his periscope. His eyes widened. There were too many. He had been trained to fear Sherman tanks only in theory, to expect maybe a handful scattered across the countryside. But here they came, wave after wave, stretching over the horizon like an unstoppable tide of steel. He counted them again, 1, 2, 10, 30, 50. His hand trembled. He could not believe what he saw. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning fuel and scorched metal. Men shouted, some screamed. A shell whistled past, missing its target by inches, kicking up dirt in a torrent of chaos. Corporal Braun in the rear of the Panzer tried to load a shell, his fingers slick with oil and sweat. It's impossible, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the enemy armor. We can't fight this many. Above them, American artillery pounded positions they had only just left. A Sherman commander, Sergeant Tommy Brown, crouched behind the hatch of his tank, gripping the radio tightly. He relayed coordinates, shouted over the gunner. Target that ridge. Keep pushing forward. His eyes darted between the advancing tanks and the German positions, calculating, anticipating, guiding. Every move counted. Every second mattered. On the left flank, a Sherman fired a precise shot, and another Panzer erupted in flames. The crew inside was thrown into the mud, coughing, dazed, the heat of the explosion still stinging their skin. Weber froze, staring at the wreck. They just keep coming, he whispered, disbelief etched into every line of his face. The noise was relentless, engines churning, tracks grinding, shells detonating. The ground shook beneath the weight of armored columns that refused to slow. Tommy Brown's voice cut through the chaos, calm but urgent over the radio. Hold the line. Don't let them regroup. Move left and cover the infantry. Somewhere behind the front, another Sherman rolled past a destroyed German tank, steam rising from its breached armor. Soldiers on foot scrambled for cover, hearts pounding, eyes wide. One young private reached for his rifle, only to freeze as a Sherman's turret rotated, almost human in its precision. This isn't just a tank, he thought. It's an army on its own. In the distance, the horizon seemed alive. Sherman after Sherman emerged from the mist, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sun. Each one alone was manageable, but together, a flood that no Panzer regiment could hope to contain. Weber's mind raced. How had the Americans produced so many? How had they managed such coordination? He glanced around at the panic spreading among his crew. Fear was contagious, hesitation deadly. And yet, amid the destruction, there was order. Tommy Brown barked commands, moving with a precision that made the chaos feel almost choreographed. He saw a Sherman lagging, stalled in the mud, and leapt into action, guiding it back into the line, coordinating fire so that each shot counted. The Americans had a rhythm, a method behind the madness that the Germans could neither anticipate nor disrupt. Lieutenant Weber tried to rally his men, but it was too late. The realization settled like ice in his veins. This was not a handful of tanks. This was a flood. Sherman after Sherman, rolling forward, relentless, coordinated, unstoppable. And at the heart of it, Tommy Brown directed the flow, eyes sharp, mind calculating, every order a thread in the tapestry of destruction unfolding before them. By the time the first full wave crashed into their position, the Panzer crews were already defeated, not just by firepower, but by the sheer inevitability of numbers. The morning mist carried screams and the roar of engines, the ground shaking with the weight of American industry turned into a weapon. Weber stared at the horizon one last time before the first tank exploded beside him. This is what we underestimated, he thought. This is what we didn't see coming. And as smoke filled the air and the sound of battle drowned all other thought, one truth became undeniable. The Sherman's might was not in its design alone, but in the countless steel soldiers rolling endlessly across the field, guided by men like Tommy Brown, who knew how to turn numbers into war itself. The laughter came first. Inside a half-collapsed farmhouse used as a temporary command post, German tank crews leaned over maps, mugs of weak coffee steaming in their hands. Someone tapped the drawing of an American tank with a pencil and smirked. The Sherman, thin armor, high silhouette, a machine that burned easily. At least, that was the belief. Tommy Brown watched from a distance, binoculars pressed to his eyes, hidden behind a hedgerow darkened by rain and exhaust smoke. He couldn't hear the laughter, but he could see the body language. Relaxed shoulders, loose movements. Men who did not yet feel hunted. Reports had already reached the German lines. The Americans were landing more tanks. Sherman tanks. Hundreds of them. But numbers on paper didn't frighten experienced crews. Not when they had Panthers. Not when they had Tigers. Not when they had trained for years to kill armor from ambush. A German gunner named Franz Keller rested his boot against the side of his Panzer IV and lit a cigarette. They're all the same, he said. Aim for the hull. They burn. That belief was everywhere in those early days. Tommy saw the first engagement unfold from a shallow rise overlooking a narrow road. A single Sherman advanced cautiously, its engine loud, almost clumsy. The German anti-tank gun was already waiting, barrel hidden behind foliage. The shot came fast, clean, precise. The Sherman exploded. Flames climbed instantly from the turret hatch. Black smoke spiraled into the sky. The German crew cheered. One tank. One shot. Proof. Tommy felt his stomach tighten. Not because the tank was lost, but because he noticed something the Germans didn't. Behind the smoke, another Sherman appeared. Then another. Then another. The road filled with steel. The German gun repositioned, firing again. Another Sherman burned. Then a third. Each kill reinforced the belief. Each explosion fed the confidence. To the German crews, it looked like validation. Inferior machines being destroyed exactly as expected. But Tommy was counting. He counted the seconds between shots. He counted reload times. He counted how long it took for smoke to clear. He counted how many tanks passed the burning wrecks without stopping. The Americans did not retreat. They drove through the fire. German commanders reported success that day. Their after-action notes spoke of easy kills and poorly designed enemy armor. On paper, it looked like control, superiority, order. On the ground, Tommy saw something else. He watched Sherman crews abandon burning tanks and immediately reappear, hours later, in new machines. Different serial numbers. Same crews. Same advance routes. Same pressure. By nightfall, the Germans had destroyed more Shermans than they could remember. By nightfall, even more had arrived. Tommy scribbled notes into a small, dirt-stained notebook. Distances. Angles. Patterns. He wasn't a commander. He wasn't a strategist. But he understood momentum. And momentum was shifting. The Germans were winning fights. The Americans were winning time. As darkness fell, the battlefield quieted. Fires still burned where Shermans had died, illuminating hedgerows and shattered fences. German crews slept close to their vehicles, confident, calm. Tommy lay awake, listening to engines in the distance. Not retreating, not regrouping, arriving. And for the first time since the landings, a thought surfaced that no German report mentioned, but every experienced soldier would eventually feel. What if destroying them isn't enough? What if there are always more? The laughter from earlier that day faded into memory. The war had not changed yet, but the illusion had cracked. And soon, that crack would spread. The first thing to disappear was sleep. German tank crews had always slept near their machines. The tank was protection. Steel walls. Familiar sounds. a sense of control. But now, sleep came in fragments. 10 minutes here, 20 there, broken by distant engines, artillery, and a sound that did not belong to the night before. Movement. Tommy Brown noticed it before dawn. The roads never fully quieted anymore. Where silence once meant safety, there was now a low, constant hum. American supply trucks, recovery vehicles, fresh tank columns moving under cover of darkness. The war was no longer pausing. At a crossroads scarred by shell craters, a German Panther waited in ambush. Its crew had done this many times before. Position. Wait. Fire. Withdraw. Clean. The first Sherman appeared exactly where expected. The gunner fired. The Sherman burned. No cheers this time, because behind it came another, and another, and another. The Panther's loader worked frantically, hands shaking as shells slammed into the breech. Each shot was accurate, each kill clean, but the space between targets collapsed. The road clogged with advancing armor, smoke, and dust. Tommy watched through binoculars as American tanks fanned out instead of stopping. Some fired blindly. Others maneuvered wide, forcing the Panther to rotate its turret faster than it should. The ambush was being swallowed by motion. A shell struck the Panther's side. Not penetrated, but enough to shake the crew. Enough to remind them they were no longer untouchable. They reversed too late. When the Panther finally pulled back, it left behind 3 burning Shermans. And gained nothing. That was the moment confidence turned into noise. German radios crackled nonstop. Requests, corrections, complaints. Units asked for more ammunition, more fuel, more time. But time was the one thing disappearing fastest. Tommy noticed how often German crews now fired at shadows, at engine sounds, at movement they couldn't confirm. Ammunition vanished faster than before. Guns overheated. Mistakes multiplied. At a repair area hidden beneath trees, a German mechanic wiped oil from his hands and stared at the horizon. "They don't stop," he said quietly. "They don't care if one burns." Tommy wrote that sentence down. The Americans were absorbing losses that would have shattered other armies. Crews were rotated. Tanks were replaced. Routes adjusted. Pressure maintained. Every destroyed Sherman was removed, replaced, and forgotten. For the Germans, every loss was permanent. A veteran commander named Otto Weiss stood beside his Tiger tank, listening to reports. His face was expressionless, but his hands betrayed him, clenching, unclenching, searching for control. "We can kill them," he said, "but we cannot clear them." Tommy saw it in the way German crews now watched the roads. Less laughter, less certainty, eyes lingering longer on the horizon, fingers resting closer to triggers. The battlefield had changed its tone. What had begun as superiority now felt like containment. What had been precision now felt like exhaustion. The Germans were still better trained, still better armed, but they were fighting an enemy that did not retreat when it should have. As evening fell, American artillery rolled forward, not to destroy, but to deny rest. Shells fell intermittently, randomly, just enough to prevent sleep. Tommy lay in a shallow depression, helmet pulled low, listening to explosions and engines overlap into a single, continuous sound. It wasn't chaos yet, but it was no longer order. The German crews would destroy more Shermans tomorrow. They knew that. Their guns were ready, their tactics sound. But beneath the confidence, something had shifted. The war was no longer asking whether the Sherman was inferior. It was asking how long superiority could survive against something that never stopped coming. And for the first time, no one had an answer. By the winter of 1944, German tank doctrine was no longer doctrine. It was adaptation. Ambushes became deeper. Positions were dug farther back. Tanks hid longer, moved less, waited for perfect shots. German crews stopped chasing kills and started hunting moments. One shell, one target, withdraw. On paper, it was flawless. On the battlefield, it was unraveling. Tommy Brown stood with an infantry liaison unit overlooking a narrow valley in France. Snow clung to the wreckage below, burned Shermans, half-buried trucks, frozen bodies locked in final positions. The Germans had chosen this ground carefully. Slopes limited movement. Trees masked approach. A textbook killing zone. The first Sherman entered the valley at 6:40. The second followed at 6:42. The third at 6:44. They did not bunch up. They did not hesitate. They moved like men who already knew losses were acceptable. When the German guns opened fire, it was devastating. 2 Shermans erupted into flame within seconds. A third lost its tracks and spun uselessly, crew bailing out into the snow. But then something happened that German doctrine had not prepared for. The Americans didn't retreat. They dismounted infantry. Tommy watched as soldiers spilled from half-tracks, rifles low, moving deliberately uphill toward the firing positions. Smoke rounds bloomed, thick and blinding. Artillery followed, not precise, but constant. The forest shook. The German tanks stayed hidden. They had to. Revealing position meant destruction, but staying hidden meant surrendering initiative. Minutes passed. Then American tank destroyers appeared at the edge of the valley, long guns probing through smoke. They weren't better armored. They weren't better protected. They were simply there. A German commander radioed for repositioning orders. None came. The network was overloaded. Too many units adjusting at once. Too many requests. Too little time. Tommy scribbled again in his notebook. They are not fighting the tanks. They are fighting the clock. By midday, the valley was unusable. Wrecks blocked movement. Smoke lingered. German crews withdrew without being overrun, but without victory. They had inflicted losses. They had gained nothing. Elsewhere, similar scenes unfolded. Tigers and Panthers achieved kill ratios that would have been legendary in earlier years. But each engagement ended the same way. The Americans absorbed the damage, adapted routes, and kept advancing. German crews noticed something else. The Shermans were changing. Not in armor thickness, but in behavior. They worked in teams. One tank drew fire. Another flanked. A third called artillery. Radios crackled with coordination that felt relentless. Losses no longer caused hesitation. One German gunner, interviewed after capture, said simply, "They drove like they expected to die." Tommy understood the deeper truth. They didn't expect to die. They expected to be replaced. German tactics relied on preservation, of machines, of crews, of ground. American tactics relied on momentum. The Sherman wasn't built to win duels. It was built to keep the war moving forward. By nightfall, German crews pulled back again. Fuel was low. Ammunition counted carefully. Repairs delayed for lack of parts. Each retreat felt temporary, but stacked together, they formed a pattern. A slow, grinding loss of space. Tommy stood beside a burned-out Sherman as snow fell quietly around it. Inside, the crew had escaped. Another tank would arrive tomorrow. Another crew would take their place. Across the line, German wrecks stayed where they fell. The tactics still worked, but they no longer mattered, because the battlefield was no longer about who destroyed more tanks. It was about who could afford to lose them, and that realization was beginning to spread, quietly, dangerously, through every German armored unit still fighting. By early 1945, German tank crews were no longer measuring success by ground taken. They measured it by survival. A Tiger that returned intact was a victory. A crew that made it through the night was a blessing. Orders spoke of counterattacks, but reality whispered something else. Delay. Hold. Slow them down. Tommy Brown heard it in the radio traffic first. The language had changed. Fewer bold commands. More caution. More requests for confirmation. Every movement weighed against fuel, ammunition, and the knowledge that retreat routes were shrinking. At a battered crossroads outside a ruined village, a Panther lay concealed behind collapsed stone walls. Its crew had already destroyed 4 Shermans that morning. Black smoke curled lazily into the gray sky. In earlier years, this would have been legend. Now, it was irrelevant. Because the road stayed open. American engineers cleared wrecks under artillery cover. Fresh Shermans rolled forward, tracks grinding over frozen earth. Infantry moved beside them, alert, methodical, unhurried. The tempo never changed. Tommy watched a German loader wipe blood from his knuckles, reloading again, slower now. Fatigue showed in every motion. The commander peered through optics, eyes red, scanning for targets that refused to disappear. Another Sherman appeared. Then another. The Panther fired. The kill was clean. But then artillery answered. Not precise, not elegant, just heavy. The ground shook. Stones fell. The air filled with dirt and shrapnel. The crew stayed buttoned up, trapped in steel and noise. Minutes later, a radio message arrived. Withdraw if possible. If possible. They reversed under smoke, engine coughing, turret stuck at an awkward angle. The tank survived. The village did not. This pattern repeated across the front. German units executed perfect defensive actions, textbook engagements taught in manuals. They inflicted losses that would have broken earlier offensives. But the Americans did not break. They replaced. Tommy wrote again, German skill is constant. American presence is endless. Captured German officers spoke bitterly. We knocked them out in groups of 5, one said. And then we look up, and there are 10 more. The Sherman had become something else entirely. Not a tank. A system. Factories. Training depots. Supply lines that stretched across oceans. Crews rotated. Machines repaired or discarded without ceremony. German tanks, by contrast, were treated like relics. Each loss mourned. Each damaged vehicle debated endlessly. Repairs delayed by missing parts. Fuel rationed to the leader. Even victories felt hollow. Tommy stood near a captured Panther, its armor scarred but intact. Inside, the crew had abandoned it for lack of fuel. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Just empty. That realization cut deeper than any shell. At night, German crews listened to engines approaching from the west. The sound no longer inspired confidence or challenge. It inspired calculation. How many rounds left? How much fuel? How far until the next fallback line? Hope shrank to hours. The Sherman had not become better. The battlefield had changed around it. By surviving long enough, by arriving in numbers that erased meaning from individual losses, it turned German superiority into exhaustion, precision into delay, victory into postponement. Tommy closed his notebook as another American column passed, headlights dimmed, engines steady. The road ahead was littered with burned steel, but it remained open. German crews would fight again tomorrow. They would destroy more tanks. They would perform brilliantly. And it would still not be enough. Because this war was no longer about who won the fight in front of them. It was about who could endure the future. And only one side had an endless supply of it. There was no single battle where it became clear. No dramatic defeat. No collapse announced over the radio. Understanding arrived quietly. Tommy Brown noticed it during a pause in the fighting. Not in the noise of combat, but in the stillness afterward. A stretch of road in western Germany, lined with wrecked armor, American and German alike, frozen in place by mud and exhaustion. A German Panther sat intact by the roadside. Its engine was cold, its gun untouched. The crew had walked away. That was new. Earlier in the war, German tanks fought until destroyed or disabled. Abandonment was unthinkable. A tank was honor, skill, identity. Now it was weight. Captured documents told the story. Fuel shortages, ammunition delays, replacement crews arriving with weeks of training instead of years, veteran commanders reassigned or dead. Tommy spoke to an American intelligence officer who had interrogated German prisoners. They still believe they're better, the officer said. They just don't believe it matters anymore. At another position, German anti-tank guns waited beside abandoned vehicles. Not destroyed, not sabotaged, simply left behind when the units moved faster than their machines could. The Americans didn't rush. They rolled around them. Shermans advanced through towns already shattered by air power. Infantry followed, clearing methodically, block by block. There was no urgency in their movement. No desperation. They knew the direction of the war. German radio chatter revealed something else. Hesitation at the command level. Orders contradicted. Counterattacks planned, then canceled. Defensive lines drawn, then redrawn. Tommy wrote, "The enemy is no longer reacting to us. We are reacting to their absence." In a forest outside Cologne, a veteran Tiger commander named Karl Heinemann gathered his crew. He spoke calmly, quietly. They had enough fuel for one engagement. Maybe two. No one asked what came after. They destroyed 6 Shermans that afternoon. Perfect shots. Clean kills. The kind of performance military academies would later study. At dusk, Heinemann ordered withdrawal. There was no fuel. They spiked the gun and left the Tiger behind. Not in defeat. In resignation. Tommy stood near the abandoned machine later, running his gloved hand across the armor. It was thicker than anything the Sherman carried. The gun could still kill at extreme range. The tank itself was a weapon unmatched, but it stood silent. Around it, American tracks carved fresh lines into the mud. That was the moment. Not when German tanks stopped killing Shermans, but when killing Shermans stopped changing anything. The front continued to move east. Every kilometer lost reduced fuel access. Every retreat shortened repair windows. Every abandoned vehicle made the next retreat harder. The spiral was tightening. German crews knew it now. Not in speeches. Not in doctrine. In the simple calculation of distance versus supply. Tommy saw it in their eyes when prisoners were taken. No shock. No hatred. Just exhaustion. Relief, sometimes. As if the weight had finally been lifted. One young German driver said quietly, "We were taught how to fight tanks, not how to fight factories." The Sherman had become a symbol of that truth. Not because it was the best tank on the battlefield, but because it represented something unstoppable. By the end of the month, German armored resistance was fragmented, still dangerous, still lethal in moments, but no longer coherent. Tommy closed his notebook for the night as American columns moved forward under overcast skies. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only momentum, the kind that does not need to prove itself, because it already knows where it is going. Tommy Brown felt the earth tremble beneath him before he saw the smoke. The American column had started its advance at dawn, stretching across muddy fields, through bombed-out villages, and along roads lined with shattered German armor. The Shermans, the workhorses of this campaign, rumbled in a steady rhythm, steel tracks biting into the wet earth, engines throbbing like distant artillery. Inside one of those tanks, Corporal James Harlow tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The interior smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. Outside, the forest moved like a living wall, hiding potential ambushes at every turn. He could hear nothing but the clatter of tracks and the occasional bark of machine guns. "Keep your head down," his gunner muttered, voice barely audible over the engine hum. Eyes open. Always. Every Sherman in this column had been measured, tested, and deployed knowing its limitations. The armor was thinner than the German Tigers, the main gun smaller, the engine weaker. Yet here they moved, dozens of machines, coordinated, relentless. Numbers mattered more than perfection. Quantity, combined with cohesion, became the weapon. Tommy walked along the flanks, notebook in hand, observing the men inside and outside the tanks. He recorded their expressions, their decisions. He saw young drivers flinch at every crack of gunfire, clutching their controls as if sheer will could protect them. But he also saw moments of grace. Mechanics quickly repairing damaged tracks under enemy fire. Medics darting across roads to pull wounded comrades to safety. Tank commanders coordinating fire like conductors of an orchestra. In one village, a Tiger emerged from the smoke, its barrel aimed with deadly precision. Harlow's Sherman took the hit, the hull shuddering as metal screamed under the German shell. Smoke filled the interior. Harlow coughed, but kept his focus. His gunner, wide-eyed, aimed blindly and fired. A second shell exploded nearby. Then another Sherman rolled into position, followed by more, and suddenly the Panthers' advantage dissolved under the sheer volume of firepower. Tommy scribbled furiously. Numbers make courage contagious. Fear spreads faster than bullets, but so does resolve. He followed the column as it pushed further into enemy territory, documenting every interaction with German soldiers. Captured crews were a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. One young conscript looked at a line of Shermans passing him and whispered, almost to himself, "How can they have so many?" That was the key. They weren't faster, they weren't stronger, they weren't perfect. But the Americans had factories, logistics, and an unrelenting rhythm that no single German crew could stop. Each Sherman that rolled forward carried the weight of thousands of industrial hands back home, invisible yet undeniable. Tommy witnessed a small skirmish at the edge of a ruined town. German infantry fired from windows, machine guns rattling against advancing Shermans. Harlow's tank returned fire, carefully aiming, conserving shells, coordinating with the tanks around him. For a brief, tense moment, it was chaos, steel, smoke, fire. Yet within that chaos, discipline shone. Orders flowed, adjustments were made, lives were saved, and the column moved forward. Later, at a crossroads, Tommy watched as a Sherman crew rescued a wounded comrade from the street. Mud soaked their uniforms, blood smeared across steel, but they carried him back to safety. It was the smallest act amid a massive advance, but it defined the difference between movement and momentum, between survival and mere endurance. Even as the day wore on, the German resistance remained dangerous. Tigers and Panthers struck from concealed positions. Ambushes shredded flanks. Yet, with every encounter, Tommy noted the same pattern. American Shermans absorbed the losses, adapted, and pressed onward. Their strength wasn't in perfection, but in persistence, in numbers, in the quiet coordination that the enemy couldn't match. By sunset, the column had advanced miles into German territory. Villages lay in ruin, roads were torn up, smoke curled from every corner. Tommy closed his notebook, exhausted, heart pounding with the rhythm of engines and artillery. He had seen the tide of war not in a single heroic act, but in the unrelenting, coordinated push of men and machines. And yet, he knew the human toll was staggering. He had walked past bodies, seen the fear in captured eyes, the exhaustion in his own allies, and felt the weight of history pressing down like a storm cloud. That night, as he sat by a campfire, Tommy Brown wrote in his notebook, "We are not invincible. We are not perfect. But together, in numbers and in courage, we are unstoppable. And the enemy knows it." Above him, the stars were dimmed by smoke, but the column rested, engines idling, men tending to wounded, tanks patched and ready. Tomorrow, the advance would continue. The tide would not pause. And Tommy knew that the same fear and disbelief that had haunted German crews would be a constant companion, shaping every engagement from here on out. The war was not over, but the path had become clear. And one man, standing at the edge of that mud-soaked field, writing the story as it happened, understood it better than most. The sun was barely rising, casting pale light across a battlefield that already smelled of smoke, oil, and fear. Tommy Brown walked along a shattered road, notebook clutched in one hand, the other tracing the scars on a burned-out Sherman. He paused, watching German tank crews gather, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. They had heard rumors, stories of American tanks rolling in vast numbers, overwhelming smaller forces. But seeing it was different. Nothing in training, nothing in propaganda, had prepared them for this. One Panther commander, a man barely 25, leaned against his machine, shaking. His crew murmured in disbelief. How can there be so many of them? Tommy watched from a ridge as Harlow's Sherman column reassembled. Engineers were already patching tracks, cleaning guns, checking fuel lines. No hesitation. No pause. A Tiger could destroy one Sherman in seconds, yet the column moved as if the loss had been anticipated. The Germans realized that sheer industrial output was more terrifying than any individual weapon. Quantity, coordination, and discipline combined into a force that no single tank could halt. In the smoke of a nearby village, another skirmish erupted. German soldiers had set up ambush positions, firing from windows and rubble. Harlow's crew returned fire, careful and methodical. The tanks moved in patterns designed to minimize exposure, covering each other with suppressive fire. Tommy scribbled furiously. They are learning faster than the enemy can react. Each tank a cog in a machine larger than itself. Fear meets preparation and falters. A young German officer, clutching a map, looked at the advancing Shermans and muttered under his breath, This is industrial war. Not skill, not courage, numbers. His men nodded silently, understanding but unable to stop the tide. Tommy followed the column as it pressed on. He saw acts of bravery, small yet crucial. A Sherman driver crawled out under fire to repair a jammed gun. A medic dashed between tanks, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. Each act was fleeting, almost invisible, but in the orchestration of the advance, it was decisive. Courage multiplied across the ranks, amplified by discipline and numbers. By midday, the first signs of German panic appeared. Lines of tanks hesitated, crews argued, some abandoned their vehicles outright. Tommy witnessed a young Panther crew surrender after realizing that American Shermans outnumbered them 3-1. He recorded every detail, the confusion, the fear, the rapid unraveling of what had seemed an unshakable enemy force. Harlow's column entered a bombed-out town, where German troops had prepared a last-ditch defense. Panzerfausts and machine guns opened fire. Shermans responded with coordinated volleys, shells striking walls and streets in precise, devastating patterns. Smoke rose in thick plumes, filling the town like a living wall. Amid the chaos, Tommy saw the faces of civilians pressed against walls, eyes wide, hands gripping each other. Survival depended not on luck, but on coordination, timing, and the courage to act under fire. Throughout the day, Tommy observed a consistent pattern. German crews underestimated the Americans at every turn. They mocked the Sherman's smaller gun, laughed at its thinner armor, scoffed at its speed. Yet every time they struck, another Sherman replaced it. Every loss was absorbed. Every attack countered. The sheer volume of tanks, combined with strategic training and logistics, broke the morale of even the most experienced German crews. By evening, the battlefield was littered with debris, burned-out tanks, twisted metal, scattered equipment, and the occasional fallen soldier. Yet Harlow's Sherman column remained largely intact, advancing steadily toward its objective. Tommy noted the irony. The very machines mocked as inferior had proven invincible through numbers, preparation, and relentless momentum. As night fell, Tommy sat on the edge of a ridge, notebook open, candle flickering in the makeshift command post. He reflected on what he had seen, the human cost, the mechanical precision, the shock in enemy eyes. The Germans had faced a force they could not outmatch, not because of individual skill, but because the Americans had turned industry into a weapon, coordination into a shield, and numbers into courage. He scribbled one last note for the day. The Sherman was not just a tank. It was an idea, a doctrine, a promise of relentless forward motion. And the enemy realized, too late, that no single act of skill could stop it. Tommy Brown looked out over the field. The smoke curled into the sky, the stars above blurred by the haze of battle. Tomorrow, the advance would continue. The German crews would reorganize, attempt counterattacks, but the tide had shifted irrevocably. One man, watching history unfold, understood it clearly. War was no longer just about individual courage. It was about preparation, persistence, and the terrifying might of human industry mobilized to its fullest. And somewhere deep in the shadows, the captured German soldiers whispered to each other, still in disbelief. How can they have so many? How can we even fight this? The answer was simple, brutal, and unstoppable. Tommy Brown closed his notebook. He had seen it. He had recorded it. And the story of the Sherman, mocked yet victorious, would not be forgotten. The first light of dawn crept over the shattered village of St. Lo, painting the ruins in a pale, ghostly gold. Tommy Brown crouched behind a crumbling wall, eyes scanning the streets where smoke still twisted from the remains of burning barns and bombed-out houses. The silence was deceptive. Every broken roof, every shattered window, held a potential threat. Hidden German soldiers, waiting for a chance to strike. Sergeant Harris motioned to his squad, signaling for a cautious advance. Tommy led the way, rifle at the ready, boots crunching over rubble. The village was quiet except for the occasional pop of distant artillery and the soft hiss of smoke curling from smoldering debris. Yet in that quiet, Tommy felt the pulse of danger. He could see it in the shadows, the flicker of movement between walls, the glint of metal under roof tiles, the small, calculated motions of an enemy waiting for them to step into a trap. They entered the main square. Once bustling with life, it now lay in ruins, cobblestones slick with mud and blood. Tommy's heart pounded as he noticed a faint trail leading into a collapsed bakery, a likely position for a hidden MG-42 team. He signaled, and the squad split into careful flanking positions. The tension was palpable, each man aware that a single misstep could ignite a firefight that would leave them exposed. Then, the first shots rang out. The crack of a machine gun tore through the air, splintering wood and stone. Private Miller dropped to the ground, barely escaping a hail of bullets that shredded the wall beside him. Tommy returned fire, taking careful aim, his breath short and measured. He felt the sting of adrenaline and fear, muscles tensed, senses razor-sharp. Around him, the village seemed to come alive with violence. Windows shattered under fire, smoke and dust mingled in the morning air, and the smell of gunpowder burned his nostrils. Amid the chaos, Tommy spotted a German soldier trying to escape across the square. He fired, watching as the man fell, sliding into a pile of rubble. For a fleeting moment, relief flared, one threat eliminated. But Tommy knew it was temporary. More could appear from the shadows at any second. Every corner, every doorway, was a potential death trap. Sergeant Harris shouted orders, rallying the squad to push forward. Tommy moved through the debris, marking potential enemy positions and coordinating small teams to suppress fire. A barn to the left exploded, flames licking the sky, illuminating figures dashing for cover. Tommy's ears rang from the blast, and he pressed himself against the wall, counting the seconds, calculating movements, thinking faster than bullets could travel. Suddenly, he froze. A group of German soldiers had set up a makeshift anti-tank barrier, waiting to ambush the approaching Sherman tanks. Tommy realized that if the tanks advanced blindly, they would be destroyed, their crews slaughtered. Without hesitation, he grabbed the radio, shouting directions to Sergeant Harris and the Sherman commanders. The tanks slowed, adjusted their approach, and avoided the trap by mere seconds. Explosions erupted behind them as they passed, too close for comfort, but survival hinged on Tommy's eyes and quick thinking. In the village square, soldiers pressed on, moving house to house, clearing pockets of resistance. Tommy noticed a young German boy, no older than 12, hiding in the rubble, clutching a doll. The child's eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the flames around them. Tommy motioned for the squad to cover him and approached cautiously, lifting the boy to safety. For a brief heartbeat, humanity pierced the violence, a reminder of what was at stake and what could be lost. By mid-morning, the village was mostly cleared. The fires still burned, casting long shadows over the cobblestones and the bodies of soldiers, both German and American, lay strewn across the streets. Tommy stood atop a half-collapsed wall, surveying the scene, sweat and soot streaking his face. He knew the fight was far from over. Pockets of resistance remained, and enemy reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Yet for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized, thanks to careful observation, split-second decisions, and the willingness to act when hesitation could mean death. And then came a sound Tommy could not ignore, a distant rumble, deeper than artillery, shaking the ground beneath their feet. He turned, binoculars pressed to his eyes, and caught sight of a column of German reinforcements approaching along the valley road. More tanks, more infantry, more chaos waiting to descend upon them. Tommy clenched his jaw, knowing that the calm they had fought to secure was only temporary. The next wave would test every ounce of skill, courage, and cunning they possessed. As he radioed warnings and organized defenses, he realized the brutal truth of this war. Survival was never guaranteed, even when firepower and numbers seemed to favor them. Each village, each street, each ambush demanded vigilance and clarity. One misjudgment, one delay, and the cost would be human lives. Tommy Brown had acted decisively today, but the battle stretched far beyond him. The war was an unending series of decisions, and each choice weighed heavier than the last. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the smoke-filled streets, Tommy knew that the next confrontation was inevitable. Somewhere in the distance, the enemy waited, watching, calculating, and ready to strike. The question lingered like the smoke in the village square. Would they be ready, or would hesitation cost more than they could bear? The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the shattered fields of Normandy. Tommy Brown sat on the edge of a bombed-out wall, rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon where the smoke of battle still rose like dark fingers clawing at the sky. The village had been cleared, yet the cost weighed heavily. Bodies, broken homes, dreams shattered before they could take root. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burning wood, and mud turned to sludge under the treads of tanks and boots of soldiers. Tommy ran his hand over the grime-streaked brick wall, feeling every crack and gouge as if they were the scars of every life lost in these streets. Around him, the surviving men of the squad moved silently, exhausted, each step tentative, haunted by what they had seen and done. Private Miller approached, clutching a journal in which he had scrawled down names, observations, and sketches of the village's destruction. He looked up at Tommy, eyes wide and tired, and said, "We did everything we could, but it still feels like it wasn't enough." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding too well. Every choice in war is a gamble, and sometimes even the right one comes with unbearable cost. Tommy's mind drifted back through the days that had led them here. The early reconnaissance, the ambushes, the fire in St. Lo, the coordination that had saved lives, and yet the knowledge that each victory was fragile. He remembered the boy in the rubble, clutching his doll, eyes wide with fear. That small act of saving one child had weighed against the chaos of the streets, against the bodies lying where bullets had found them first. War demanded calculation, yet offered no fairness. A faint sound reached Tommy from the valley below, a lone dog barking somewhere in the ruins, a reminder that life persisted even amid devastation. He lowered his rifle, letting himself breathe for a moment. Around him, other soldiers gathered what they could salvage, sharing water, wrapping wounds, comforting each other in the small ways humanity persisted. They were exhausted, bruised, and haunted, yet alive. Alive in a world that had almost swallowed them. Then came the sound, a distant, rhythmic clatter. Reinforcements, tanks, and infantry, moving through the morning fog. Tommy's hand went instinctively to the radio. He spoke quickly, clear and precise, directing the squad to ready positions, coordinating with Sherman crews, and warning of traps along the valley road. The next wave was coming, inevitable and relentless. The quiet of survival was temporary, the pulse of battle would return. And yet, in that moment of preparation, a profound truth settled over him. War was not just machines, bullets, and strategy. It was decisions. Every split-second choice could save or end a life. Every observation, every action, every hesitation mattered. Tommy Brown had acted when others might have hesitated, seen what others could not, and made the impossible calculation of human and mechanical variables in seconds. Without him, more lives would have been lost. He thought of the villagers, of the boy with the doll, of the families whose homes had been reduced to rubble. He thought of the German soldiers, many barely older than himself, fighting for survival just as desperately. And he thought of his own squad, weary, alive, but carrying the invisible scars of what they had endured. History often records the battles, the victories, the losses in numbers, but never the human heartbeat behind each decision, each sacrifice. As the enemy column appeared in the mist, Tommy took a deep breath. The sun now fully illuminated the scarred land, revealing the extent of the destruction and the fragile threads of survival. He raised his hand, signaling the squad. Orders were shouted, engines roared, and the air filled with the tension of anticipation, that terrifying pause before the storm of gunfire and steel. But Tommy also understood something else. War did not end with victory or defeat. It ended in the choices, in the vigilance, in the courage to act when inaction would mean death. And he had chosen. He had acted. And for this moment, for these lives, that choice mattered. Hours passed, the engagement began, and slowly, the tide turned. Pockets of enemy resistance were neutralized. Tanks advanced safely through the valley. Infantry secured the roads. Smoke curled into the sky. Fire still flickered among ruins, but order, however temporary, was returning. Tommy stood amidst it all, exhausted, covered in soot and blood, yet acutely aware of the fragile balance that kept them alive. He lowered his rifle again, surveying the battlefield with weary eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the enormity of survival, not just the physical act, but the moral weight of witnessing, of acting, of deciding when so much hung in the balance. The village of St. Lo would bear scars for decades. The soldiers would carry invisible wounds for a lifetime. And Tommy Brown, one man in an endless war, would remember every second, every heartbeat, every choice that had saved or condemned. And in the quiet that followed, he whispered to himself, almost as a vow, "We cannot control everything. We cannot prevent every shadow. But we can watch. We can act. We can survive." And that is how humanity endures. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the ruins and the living alike. Birds cautiously emerged. Children would someday return, and soldiers would march on. But the memory of St. Lo, of fire and smoke, of lives saved and lost, would never fade. And Tommy Brown, witness and actor, would carry it forward, a reminder that courage, observation, and action were the fragile, beating heart of survival in a world defined by chaos.